Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. As we completed the 5-part lecture series called Concept of God and the Evidence, we responded to few most common claims or arguments made by the atheists or materialists in those series. We now start a new series responding to specific claims or arguments made by atheists, and the reason I picked Richard Dawkins is that many atheists echo Dawkins' sentiments and argument as he has become sort of a leading voice for the atheists. Hence, we are hoping by responding to him we can address many of his followers or those who think similarly. To do so, I have selected several arguments from his book relevant to this topic called The God Delusion, published some time ago. My intention is not to respond to every page and paragraph of this book for obvious reasons, among which is time and desire, but my hope is to address claims or arguments which I thought were most relevant and common among the atheists, plus let the audience have a taste of Dawkins' claims so they can then judge for themselves. In other words, what I present in this series should hopefully give you some idea on his methodology and thought process so you can judge for yourself. My only request for those with open heart and open mind who genuinely want to understand the opposing point of views is to please listen to my recent 5-part lecture series called Concept of God and the Evidence first to understand our arguments as well as few of the most common claims by atheists which we presented counter arguments there, drawing on evidence, logic, and different perspectives. Then listen to these series as we will consider his central arguments in his book, then provide our counter arguments. This way you will have the background on our views as well as understanding the context, as I will make references to the points made there in those lecture series, so we don't have to repeat in length here in this series. Dawkins' central argument, according to his book, listed at the end of chapter 4, is as follows. Number 1, one of the greatest challenges to the human intellect over the centuries has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. Number 2, natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. In the case of man-made artifacts such as a watch, the designer really was an intelligent engineer. It is tempting to apply the same logic to an eye or a wing, a spider, or a person. Number 3, the temptation is a false one. Because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. The whole problem we started out with was the problem of explaining statistical improbability. It is obviously no solution to postulate something even more improbable. We need a crane, not a skyhook, for only a crane can do the business of working up gradually and plausibly from simplicity to otherwise improbable complexity. Number 4, the most ingenious and powerful crane so far discovered is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. Darwin and his successors have shown how living creatures, with their spectacular statistical improbability and appearance of design, have evolved by slow, gradual degrees from simple beginnings. We can now safely say that the illusion of design in living creatures is just that, an illusion. Number 5, we don't yet have an equivalent crane for physics. Some kind of multiverse theory could in principle do for physics the same explanatory work as Darwinism does for biology. This kind of explanation is superficially less satisfying than the biological version of Darwinism because it makes heavier demand on luck. Number 6, we should not give up hope of a better crane arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. If the argument of this chapter is accepted, the factual premise of religion, the God hypothesis, is untenable. God almost certainly does not exist. We will answer these as we respond to his relevant arguments more in detail. By the way, in parentheses, his conclusion, therefore God almost certainly does not exist, cannot be drawn from these 6 central arguments he lists or considered as valid arguments or valid premises. At best, what Dawkins could argue would be that one should not conclude that God exists based on the design of the universe. However, even if that was true, it doesn't mean that God does not exist. It doesn't prove that. There are many other arguments, among which we presented a few in the Concept of God and the Evidence lecture series, where we barely scratched the surface. Again, my intention is not to address every paragraph and page, but rather my aim and hope is to address claims or arguments which I thought were most relevant and common among the atheists, most of which will address Dawkins' central arguments as well. For each argument, I will quote Dawkins from his book and then provide a response in somewhat brief length so we can cover a reasonable number of arguments within various categories in this series. In chapter 4, under irreducible complexity section, Dawkins brings up an important point. He says, I could mention the anatomy, cellular structure, biochemistry, and behavior of literally any given organism by example, but the most striking feats of apparent design are those picked out for obvious reasons by creationist authors, and it is with gentle irony that I derive mine from a creationist book called Life, How Did It Get Here? Picking a page at random from this anonymous and lavishly distributed work, we find the sponge known as Venus's flower basket, which is also called Euplectella, accompanied by a quotation from Sir David Attenborough, no less, Attenborough said, when you look at a complex sponge skeleton such as that of made silica specules, which is known as Venus's flower basket, the imagination is baffled. How could quasi-independent microscopic cells collaborate to secrete 1,000,000 glassy splinters and construct such an intricate and beautiful lattice? We do not know. Dawkins then says, the Watchtower authors lose no time in adding their own punchline. But one thing we do know, chance is not the likely designer. No, indeed, says Dawkins. Chance is not the likely designer. That is one thing on which we all can agree. So then what's the problem? If you agree chance is not the designer, the statistical improbability of phenomena such as Venus's flower basket skeleton is the central problem that any theory of life must solve. The greater the statistical improbability, the less plausible is chance as a solution. That is what improbable means, and we all agree on that. But the candidate solution to the riddle of improbability are not, as is falsely implied, design and chance. They are design and natural selection. He admits it is design, but through natural selection. He then says, chance is not a solution, given the high levels of improbability we see in living organisms, and no sane biologist ever suggested that it was. No sane biologist ever suggested that it was. Okay. Now, in summary, he then says that because chance cannot be the cause, the believers, the theists, insert intelligent design as the cause where it should be natural selection. In response, we have three fundamental issues with his reasoning. The first issue is that natural selection, if true, is supposed to occur after beings or life form appears, thereafter selected as a result of survival of the fittest. Thus, life forms must exist first before natural selection is made. And natural selection is not the first cause or prove how things and beings appeared or origin of life. Here we don't need to get into argument about the original living cell, which was initially proposed to have been formed by chance, then refuted later due to complex structure of living cell, making it impossible by either chance or even synthesis in the lab. Because also Dawkins already admits even Venus's flower basket in his example could not be designed by chance, let alone the original life it came from. The second issue with his reasoning is that because he insists natural selection occurs over a period of time, hence that proves God does not exist, he has rejected the natural mutation. In other words, what Dawkins is implying is that if things appeared all of a sudden without any time lapse, then existence of creator is unavoidable, and the believer's claim is true. But because we have a time lapse due to natural selection, then their claim is not true. So the natural mutation that scientists have shown and proved must be a proof for existence of a creator, because these mutations occur almost with no time lapse. Keep in mind, in Darwin's and Lamarck's time, genes had not been discovered, or the topic was not considered or explored as it is today. As such, they believed in a time-based evolution, or shall we say, they thought for a being to evolve, time must pass through multiple generations as minute changes occur in each generation until between the first generation and the last one, there is a considerable difference, almost to the point they become two different beings or species, a complete changeover. However, this theory in and of itself poses some issues, which is, if someone loses a limb or parts of his body, for example, for various reasons, not only his children, but many generations later will not be born without that specific limb or organ. Even a natural born blind person will have children who are not blind, etc. All to say, time is not a factor here, and the issue is much deeper than that. And that is where the modern science of genes and DNA come in and did not exist in Darwin's time. It is this modern science of genes and DNA that tell us these genes must change in order for any change in the next generations, or evolution, if you will, to occur, because we inherit them from our forefathers. Any changes to the genes occur almost instantly through mutation or a cross-species jump. Or you could say these changes can be spontaneous, meaning they arise naturally without external factors, or they can be induced by environmental agents like radiation or chemicals. However, in practice, they have not been able to produce such results where a completely different species is produced due to mutation, like a horse giving birth to a dog. We have not experienced anything like that due to changes in the genes. So we say to Dawkins, you reject God because you think different species or evolution came about due to natural selection over a period of time, but in fact you are implying if there was a jump due to mutation, that is work of another cause, an external cause, who is God, who causes repeatable production of same species. Mutation or jump is something many biologists have acknowledged. Third issue with Dawkins' argument is that when he says this natural selection occurred gradually over time, the same Venus's flower basket he mentions as example, we ask, was there an aim with its natural development or not? There are things that relate to each other or somehow connect with each other without any final goal, without any material benefit to themselves or others. Is there a difference between a gradual movement or natural development with an aim, a goal, and a gradual movement or development that has no goal or aim? Was there a goal in this flower basket's gradual development that it must reach and be repeated with other flower baskets as a pattern? He answers the question himself by saying, how could quasi-independent microscopic cells collaborate to secrete a million glassy splendors and construct such an intricate and beautiful lattice? So even a gradual development, a gradual movement in and of itself does not reject God. Those who bring gradual movement as an evidence for existence of God say this or that gradual movement and development has aim, has a goal, or guided toward a purpose, much like the human brain that is constructed in such a way that may not understand something, a concept instantly, but through discoveries, contemplation, analysis, observation, intellectual reasoning, etc., reaches a solid conclusion, a useful, rational understanding of a concept in stages over time. Or do we say because it was done in stages over time, there is no thought process, no reflection, nor intellectual reasoning in it? Therefore, this gradual development over time proposed by Dawkins and company as an argument does not solve these three issues we raised. In fact, the issues we raise here argue otherwise. This applies to his other example he calls Dutchman's pipe, and in fact all his arguments in this particular category as well. In a related topic in chapter 4, under the section of natural selection as a consciousness raiser, he says, I'm continually astonished by those theists who, far from having their consciousness raised in the way that I propose, seem to rejoice in natural selection as God's way of achieving his creation. They note that evolution by natural selection would be a very easy and neat way to achieve a world full of life. God wouldn't need to do anything at all. Peter Atkins in the book takes this line of thought to a sensibly godless conclusion when he postulates a hypothetically lazy God who tries to get away with as little as possible in order to make a universe containing life. Atkins' lazy God is even lazier than the deist God of the 18th century Enlightenment, Deus Otissus, literally God at leisure, unoccupied, unemployed, superfluous, useless. Step by step, Atkins succeeds in reducing the amount of work the lazy God has to do until he finally ends up doing nothing at all. He might as well not bother to exist. A God that does nothing at all. Again, it is important to notice when he says evolution by natural selection, that is not the genesis of all beings. It does not include the first appearance of life forms before the evolution and the natural selection. He conveniently skips the first cause completely. The theists or believers say before the so-called evolution through natural selection, there was creation of life forms. Even evolution in any shape and form in and of itself would be designed toward a goal and purpose as discussed. Hence, aim by intelligence. He then wants to reject existence of God by calling God lazy, unoccupied, or unemployed, superfluous, all because God has designed and automated everything with cause and effect, along with himself as the original cause. But, according to Dawkins, no. He was supposed to create all stars and galaxies without gravitational forces to maintain order and balance, but rather do it manually with his hand. He should not have brought rain through clouds and winds, rather just continuously produce water himself somehow and send it down. And should have continuously interrupt things such as his own laws of nature, otherwise he's a lazy God. According to Dawkins, then, an engineer who designs and builds a fully automated factory that produces various products is a lazy person because he should have done a production line with his own hands and produced them one by one. If he did that, he would be an intelligent person. Now that he has designed and built an automated factory, he's a lazy individual without intelligence. You call this logic and reason? From the Quranic perspective, we have كُلَّ يَوْمٍ هُوَ فِي شَأْنٍ. Every day he exercises universal power. Every day he's bringing about a matter. From Islamic point of view, God has two statures. One is that he is the creator and originator, and the second one is that he is the sustainer. As the Quran gives many examples throughout, like إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُمْسِكُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ أَن تَزُولَا وَلَئِنْ زَالَتَا إِنْ أَمْسَكَهُمَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ. Indeed, God holds the heavens and the earth so they don't cease and if they should cease, no one could hold them in place after him. So, according to Islam, God is not only the first cause, but also the sustaining cause. The order of universe is continuously maintained. Why? Because the whole universe itself is constantly changing. From every atom, molecule, or cell to stars and galaxies are all constantly changing, as materialists have admitted themselves. With that in mind, imagine if everything that produces everything else in state of change itself. How could then this vast order be maintained? If the main producer, the nature, and every component or the material which produced us itself is constantly changing, then how could the connections and relationships between nature and its products be maintained or kept from chaos? The only conclusion is that there must be another cause, a sustainer that maintains the laws of physics constant through all the changes. So the connections, relationships, and proportions are sustained accordingly, so the order is maintained. Hence the Quran says, indeed, God holds the heavens and the earth, so they do not cease. And if they should cease, no one could hold them in place after him. We discussed this in the lecture series called Concept of God and Evidence in more detail. Now, in chapter 4, under irreducible complexity section, Dawkins says, Darwin devoted an entire chapter of the origin of species to difficulties on the theory of descent with modification. And it is fair to say that this brief chapter anticipated and disposed of every single one of the alleged difficulties that have since been proposed right up to the present day. The most formidable difficulties are Darwin's organs of extreme perfection and complication, sometimes erroneously described as irreducibly complex. Darwin singled out the eye as posing a particularly challenging problem. Quoting Darwin, to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable devices for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Clearly and explicitly admitted by Darwin himself. Darwin's false, and then he continues, Darwin's fulsomely free confession turned out to be a rhetorical device. He was drawing his opponents toward him so that his punch, when it came, struck the harder. The punch, of course, was Darwin's effortless explanation of exactly how the eye evolved by gradual degrees. First, let's see if Darwin had an effortless punch. Darwin did not have an effortless explanation of the eye's evolution, as he acknowledged the difficulty of explaining how such a complex organ could have evolved through natural selection in his book. However, he did propose a theory of gradual evolution where small beneficial variations are accumulated over time, potentially leading to the complex eye. He argued that natural selection would favor those variations that improved vision even slightly, And these beneficial traits would be then passed on to future generations. In essence, Darwin's approach to the eye's evolution was not a straightforward explanation, but rather a hypothesis based on the principle of natural selection operating on gradual variations over a long period of time. It does not appear anywhere Darwin has even alluded that eye came without a major part like iris or retina or lens, and that these major components were developed over a long period of time. Hence, his statement that the idea of natural selection producing the eye, quote, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree, unquote. We responded to this irreducible complexity in the concept of God lectures. In short, firstly, the eye is one of the most manifest pieces of evidence that living creatures are created with. All sight organs, including animal eye and the human eye, possess extremely striking features. This exceptional organ is overwhelmingly complex. The human eye contains hundreds of millions of molecules, primarily located within the photoreceptor cells of the retina, all of which must work in harmony in order for us to see things properly as they are. Otherwise, we cannot see the depths, colors, resolutions, clarity, autofocus to different distances, allowing different amounts of light, etc., etc. In order for an eye to see, all of its parts have to be together in concert, coexist together. For instance, if an eye happened to lost its eyelids, but still had all the internal parts like the cornea, iris, pupil, eye lenses, retina, choroid, eye muscles, and tear glands, it would still be greatly damaged and soon lose its vision. In the same manner, even if all its organelles were present, but something as simple as tear production were to stop, then the eye would soon dry out and eventually go blind. The chain of accidents or natural selection asserted by evolutionists loses all its meanings against the complex structure of the eye, as Darwin suggested. The human eye is a multi-section system, and as discussed, all of its individual sections had to come into existence at the same time. An evolutionist scientist admitted it when he said the common trait of the eyes and the wings is that they can only function if they are fully developed. In other words, a halfway developed eye cannot see. A bird with half-formed wings cannot fly, which shows that the eye appeared in a single moment and perfectly together with all its components. In other words, like all other organs, God created the eye as a complete system to work for a single purpose, which is true vision. Now, in his book, Optics, the great physicist Isaac Newton questioned whether the eye could have been contrived without skill in optics, implying that its design required divine intervention. In other words, functioning of the eye follows optical laws, which points to the fact that the one who designed it must have known about the optical laws. Newton then followed design and order of the eye and its intricate structure and function point to a divine creator. Then you have evolutionists like Dawkins, who goes through extreme fringe and absurd examples to say very gradually over time, as human evolved, the human eye could still function partially before it was fully developed, just like a bird who can still fly with one wing, meaning one wing can slow down its crash. Dawkins adds, a cataract patient with the lens of her eye surgically removed can't see clear images without her glasses, but can see enough not to bump into a tree or fall over a cliff. However, according to Mayo Clinic and other eye experts, removing the eye's natural lens, either due to cataract surgery or other reasons, results in the condition known as aphakia. Without the lens to focus light, the eye becomes functionally blind at all distances, and vision is severely blurry. To restore vision, a replacement lens known as an interocular lens, IOL, is typically implanted. But according to Dawkins, the patient can see enough not to run into a tree or fall over a cliff, hence can survive even generation after generation with such vision until natural selection is completed. It is amazing how, not being an ophthalmologist or optical physicist, not having any expertise in optics by any measure, Dawkins can still pontificate, suggesting the eye could still see without all its parts and continuously for as long as the person lives, and even through next generations. An eye that with smallest accident or a very local disease can be fully impaired, he claims it to be working even before it was completed with all its sections. The experts say without something simple like eye tears, or with insufficient tears, eye becomes dry, leading to irritation and eventually vision problems, including increased risk of infections, corneal damage, and even vision loss, let alone the major parts. You can look up the significance of missing major parts. Secondly, Dawkins does not realize that by making such a claim, he is presenting a counter-argument against himself. That is, even if we ignore all the facts by the experts and accept Dawkins' theory and say the eye partially functioned as it evolved, that means it was designed toward a goal, a purpose, by order and design to begin with, in order to reach its final goal of 20/20 vision, which is the complete eye we have today, which in and of itself is the evidence for intelligent design. In chapter 3, under the argument from beauty section, Dawkins says, another character in the Aldous Huxley novel proved the existence of God by playing Beethoven's String Quartet No. 15 in A minor on a gramophone. Unconvincingly as that sounds, it does represent a popular strand of argument. I have given up counting the number of times I received the more or less defiant challenge. How do you account for Shakespeare then? And then in parentheses says, substitute Schubert, Michelangelo, etc. to taste. The argument will be so familiar, I needn't document it further. But the logic behind it is never spelled out, and the more you think about it, the hollower you realize it to be. Obviously, Beethoven's late quartets are sublime. So are Shakespeare's sonnets. They are sublime if God is there, and they're sublime if He isn't. They do not prove the existence of God. They prove the existence of Beethoven and of Shakespeare. And then he says, A great conductor is credited with saying, if you have Mozart to listen to, why would you need God? Firstly, beauty is related to symmetry, balance, and proportion of things to each other. Proportion of things come from order, nizam of things in the universe. Therefore, beauty argument is not an independent argument, rather follows order by design or is under order by design argument, for which Mr. Dawkins did not have much to say other than, if we accept order by designer, then who created the designer? Which we said the designer must be outside of time, space, and matter. Otherwise, any entity within these dimensions is within the created or has a creator. Of course, any entity within creation is an occurrence, hadith, meaning there was a time it did not exist and in time came to existence. Thus, the question of who created the designer is meaningless for an entity who created time among other dimensions. Secondly, to us, because beauty is a sub-argument to order by design argument, we do not say, because someone has beauty, therefore God exists. Rather say, proportionality, balance, symmetry, and beauty all come from order by design argument. However, when he says they do not prove the existence of God, they prove the existence of Beethoven and of Shakespeare, we ask Dawkins if Beethoven and Shakespeare were people with no talents and aptitudes or were insane. Could they have composed such masterpieces and beauty? The obvious answer is, of course not. Therefore, behind this beauty, there is an intelligence organizing with order and awareness which these people possessed. We can then generalize it and say, behind all beauties of the world, there is awareness and order that has created such subtleties, symmetries, balance, and beauties. We stop here with these categories of argument listed in Dawkins' book and continue with other arguments next time, inshallah. والسلام على من اتبع الهدى.